There are evenings when Winston, a small mouse dressed in a carefully pressed charcoal vest and a slightly faded burgundy tie, sits alone beside the warm amber glow of his desk lamp while rain quietly taps against the apartment window overlooking the restless city below. And during those quiet moments, he often opens the investment app on his old tablet to stare at a number that seems both comforting and strangely disappointing at the same time. $100,000 invested. To many people, that number sounds life-changing, almost magical, like a doorway into effortless passive income and permanent financial freedom. And somewhere deep in his mind, Winston once believed the same thing too, imagining that reaching six figures invested would instantly unlock a stream of cash large enough to remove stress from his life forever. Yet the reality sitting in front of him feels far more complicated than the fantasy he had carried for years. As he adjusts his glasses and watches the dividend estimate projected across the screen, he notices something unsettling that most investors never stop to think about carefully enough. Depending on where the money is invested, that same $100,000 could generate almost nothing each month, or it could produce surprisingly large payouts that seem exciting at first glance. And the difference between those outcomes is not simply about earning more, but about the hidden trade-off between immediate income and long-term wealth creation that quietly shapes the future of nearly every investor without them fully realizing it. Winston remembers the first time he heard someone online confidently claim that dividend investing was the ultimate secret to escaping work forever, because the idea sounded emotionally irresistible. Owning stocks that pay you while you sleep feels almost like discovering a hidden loophole in life itself. And for a while, he became fascinated with the dream of building a portfolio that could shower him with monthly payments large enough to cover rent, food, and perhaps even the occasional luxury without ever needing to sell a single share. But over time, after reading annual reports late into the night and studying how wealthy investors actually built their fortunes, he began noticing something strange. The investors who became truly wealthy were often not the ones obsessing over the biggest dividend payouts today, but the ones quietly holding businesses capable of becoming dramatically more valuable over decades. That realization unsettled him because it forced him to confront a difficult possibility. Maybe the excitement of seeing cash hit your account every month could sometimes distract you from building the largest future possible. Sitting there in silence, with the city lights reflecting softly against the polished buttons of his vest, Winston realizes that most people ask the wrong question entirely when they think about investing $100,000. They ask, how much income can this money generate right now? When perhaps the far more important question is, what kind of future can this money build if I give it enough time? And the deeper he thinks about it, the more he begins to understand that the answer to that question may completely reshape the way a person approaches investing, risk, patience, and even their vision of financial freedom itself. As the night deepens and the distant sound of traffic fades into a low, almost hypnotic hum beneath the apartment window, Winston leans back in his chair and begins thinking about the first investment path most people instinctively choose when they finally save a meaningful amount of money: placing everything into a broad market index fund that quietly tracks the largest companies in the economy. At first glance, this strategy feels almost boring compared to flashy dividend stocks constantly promoted online, because the income it produces appears surprisingly small relative to the size of the investment itself. Winston studies the numbers carefully and realizes that a $100,000 investment in a fund mirroring the S&P 500 might generate only around $1,500 per year in dividends, which breaks down to roughly $125 per month before taxes. Hardly the kind of dramatic passive income capable of transforming someone's lifestyle overnight. For many inexperienced investors, this feels deeply disappointing, almost insulting even, because the emotional expectation attached to $100,000 invested is often far larger than the actual cash flow reality. Yet as Winston traces the historical performance charts across the glowing screen with his small paw, he notices something far more important hiding beneath those modest dividend payments. Over long periods of time, the majority of wealth created by the stock market has not come from dividends at all, but from the increasing value of the underlying businesses themselves. The realization begins settling into his mind slowly, almost uncomfortably, because it challenges the emotional narrative most people secretly want to believe. Human beings naturally crave visible rewards. They want proof that their money is working, and nothing feels more tangible than cash arriving directly into a bank account every few months. But capital appreciation is quieter, less emotionally satisfying in the short term, because it exists mostly as unrealized growth sitting silently inside the portfolio year after year. Winston starts imagining two different versions of himself standing decades into the future. One version constantly chasing high payouts to feel financially productive in the present moment, and another version patiently allowing strong businesses to expand, innovate, and compound their value over time without demanding immediate rewards. The contrast between those futures fascinates him because it reveals something deeper about human psychology itself. Many investors are not necessarily pursuing maximum wealth. They are pursuing emotional reassurance. As he reflects on this idea, Winston remembers how easy it is for people to underestimate the extraordinary force of compounding simply because compounding feels invisible at first. A portfolio growing at 10% annually may seem unimpressive during the early years, but over decades it can transform an ordinary investment into something massive, almost difficult to comprehend emotionally. He begins realizing that broad market investing is not designed to impress impatient people seeking excitement or fast cash flow. It is designed to quietly reward discipline, patience, and the willingness to think in timeframes most individuals struggle to tolerate. And perhaps that is exactly why so many people abandon it too early, because the path toward real wealth often looks painfully unremarkable in the beginning, while the illusion of fast passive income feels immediately gratifying even when it may ultimately produce far less financial freedom in the long run. A few nights later, while a cold wind drifts softly through the narrow gap in the apartment window, and the golden city lights flicker against the glass like distant stars, Winston finds himself drawn toward a very different kind of investment strategy, one that appears far more exciting on the surface and far more emotionally satisfying to the average investor. Wearing his neatly buttoned vest and carefully adjusting the cuffs of his tiny white shirt, he opens a list of high-yield dividend stocks that promise payouts so large they almost seem unreal compared to the modest income produced by broad index funds. Suddenly, the numbers begin looking dramatically more attractive. Instead of earning only a small monthly amount from $100,000 invested, Winston realizes that certain companies could potentially generate $6,000 or even $7,000 per year in dividends, enough to create the illusion that true passive income freedom is suddenly within reach. He imagines what that money could mean in everyday life: rent partially covered, groceries no longer stressful, weekend trips becoming possible without guilt, perhaps even the comforting feeling of waking up knowing the portfolio itself is producing income while he sleeps. For a moment, the emotional appeal feels overwhelming, and he completely understands why so many investors become obsessed with chasing high dividend yields after seeing numbers like these for the first time. Yet as he continues researching deeper into the businesses behind those generous payouts, something begins to bother him. Many of these companies operate in industries that no longer expand rapidly. Their growth appears slower, their innovation less aggressive, and their future opportunities far more limited than the dynamic technology firms transforming the modern economy. It suddenly dawns on Winston that a company paying extremely high dividends is often doing so because it no longer has many powerful ways to reinvest that money back into explosive growth. Instead of using profits to develop revolutionary products, conquer new markets, or accelerate future earnings. The business simply returns a large portion of cash to shareholders because expansion opportunities have become smaller and less exciting over time. The insight feels strangely sobering because it forces Winston to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the investments producing the highest income today are sacrificing the very growth that creates extraordinary wealth tomorrow. As he stares thoughtfully at the charts, he begins comparing the situation to an aging factory owner who no longer sees opportunities to expand his business. So he distributes most of the profits instead of building something larger for the future. There is nothing inherently wrong with this approach, of course, especially for investors who genuinely need immediate income. But Winston begins noticing how easily people confuse high cash flow with high-quality investing. The emotional satisfaction of receiving large dividend payments can become so intoxicating that investors stop asking whether the underlying business is actually becoming stronger over time. Worse still, some companies maintain dangerously high dividend payouts not because they are thriving, but because reducing those payouts would terrify investors and collapse the stock price. This realization sends a subtle chill through Winston as he remembers stories of investors who built entire portfolios around unusually high yields, only to watch both the dividend and the share price collapse simultaneously when economic conditions became difficult. In those moments, the promised safety of passive income suddenly transformed into financial pain from two directions at once: disappearing income and shrinking wealth. Sitting quietly beneath the dim amber light, Winston slowly understands that high dividend investing is not automatically bad, but it is far more complex and psychologically deceptive than most people realize. What appears safe and rewarding on the surface can sometimes conceal stagnation, fragility, or long-term underperformance hiding quietly underneath the comforting stream of cash payments. And perhaps the most dangerous part of all is that the strategy feels so emotionally satisfying that many investors stop questioning it altogether. On another quiet evening, long after the city outside has softened into a sea of distant lights and muffled sounds, Winston sits at his desk with a cup of cooling coffee beside him and begins studying a completely different category of companies. Businesses that at first seem almost disappointing to income-focused investors because they pay little to no meaningful dividends at all. Dressed as always in his neatly tailored vest, with one small paw resting against the edge of the keyboard, he scrolls through the financial histories of enormous technology companies whose products have quietly reshaped the modern world. And what immediately captures his attention is not the tiny dividend yields they offer, but the extraordinary pace at which their revenues, profits, and influence have expanded over time. Unlike mature high-yield companies that distribute large portions of their earnings to shareholders, these businesses appear obsessed with reinvesting nearly every available dollar back into growth. They pour money into research, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, global expansion, advanced manufacturing, and entire ecosystems designed to dominate industries for decades into the future. To someone chasing immediate passive income, this strategy can feel frustratingly unrewarding because the actual cash arriving in the investor's account remains incredibly small. A $100,000 investment focused heavily on growth-oriented businesses might produce only a few $100s per year in dividends, barely enough to notice after taxes and inflation. At first glance, the arrangement almost feels unfair, as though the investor is receiving nothing in return for risking such a large amount of capital. Yet the more Winston examines the historical outcomes of these companies, the more he begins realizing that their real gift to shareholders was never current income in the first place. It was the breathtaking expansion of value over long periods of time. He imagines an investor purchasing shares decades ago, back when the dividend seemed laughably tiny and the companies themselves were still growing aggressively, only to watch those investments multiply again and again, until the original purchase transformed into wealth far beyond what high dividend payouts alone could likely have created. This thought lingers heavily in Winston's mind because it reveals something emotionally difficult about long-term investing. The strategies that often create the greatest fortunes usually feel the least exciting in the beginning. There are no large monthly payments creating dopamine hits, no illusion of instantly replacing a salary, no thrilling sense that the portfolio is working hard every quarter. Instead, there is mostly patience, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable act of trusting that invisible compounding is quietly building something much larger beneath the surface. As Winston reflects on this, he starts understanding why so many investors abandon growth-focused investing too early. Human beings crave evidence and reassurance. They want to feel progress immediately, and dividend payments provide visible confirmation that something tangible is happening. Growth investing, on the other hand, often demands emotional endurance because the rewards arrive slowly at first and only become extraordinary much later. The realization reminds Winston of planting a tiny sapling in barren soil while neighbors nearby harvest fruit from smaller trees every season. Watching others collect immediate rewards can make patience feel foolish, even when the long-term outcome may ultimately be far greater. Yet history repeatedly shows that some of the world's most successful companies became wealth-generating machines precisely because they resisted the temptation to prioritize large dividends too early. Instead of distributing profits for short-term satisfaction, they focused on building larger ecosystems, stronger competitive advantages, and deeper technological dominance capable of compounding shareholder wealth for decades. Sitting silently beneath the warm desk lamp, Winston begins seeing the hidden tension that exists at the center of nearly every investment decision. The battle between wanting comfort today and wanting abundance tomorrow. And perhaps the hardest part of investing is that the human mind naturally pulls toward immediate emotional rewards, even when logic quietly points toward long-term patience instead. As midnight settles over the city and a faint reflection of neon lights shimmers across the polished surface of Winston's desk, he begins thinking less about specific stocks and more about something far more personal and far more important: time itself. Sitting quietly in his pressed charcoal vest with his tie slightly loosened after hours of reading financial reports, he realizes that the entire debate between dividend income and growth investing becomes almost meaningless unless it is connected to a person's actual stage of life and future goals. For years, Winston believed there had to be one perfect investment strategy that worked for everyone, some universal formula capable of guaranteeing wealth regardless of age or circumstance. But the deeper he studies the behavior of successful investors, the more he understands that investing is deeply tied to personal timelines, emotional needs, and the invisible pressures shaping each individual's life. A young investor in their 20s with decades ahead of them exists in a completely different reality from someone approaching retirement who depends on portfolio income to survive. Yet despite this obvious truth, countless people still copy strategies designed for entirely different financial situations simply because the visible results look attractive online. Winston remembers seeing videos where retirees proudly displayed thousands of dollars in monthly dividend income while traveling in motorhomes or relaxing near beaches, and he understands why those images are so psychologically powerful. They create the seductive impression that dividend investing itself was the magical path that created the wealth being displayed. But as he reflects more carefully, he notices something most viewers never stop to consider. Those investors likely spent decades accumulating assets and growing their net worth long before they shifted toward heavy income generation. The dividends visible today are not the beginning of the story. They are the final stage of a process that may have started 30 or 40 years earlier. This realization changes everything for Winston, because it exposes how dangerously misleading it can be to imitate the ending chapter of someone else's financial life, while completely ignoring the journey that made it possible. He begins imagining two versions of a young investor starting with the same $100,000. The first becomes obsessed with maximizing dividend income immediately, chasing stocks paying 7 or 8% yields because the monthly cash flow feels emotionally rewarding and creates the illusion of rapid financial progress. The second investor, though receiving almost no income in the early years, focuses instead on accumulating ownership in businesses capable of growing dramatically over decades. At first, the dividend-focused investor appears to be winning because tangible cash arrives consistently, creating excitement and reassurance. Meanwhile, the growth-focused investor sees little visible reward and may even feel impatient or discouraged during long periods where the portfolio produces almost no spendable income at all. But as decades pass, the difference between the two approaches begins widening in ways that are difficult to appreciate emotionally when viewed only over short periods of time. The investor prioritizing long-term growth may eventually reach a point where the portfolio has expanded so dramatically that even a modest dividend yield now generates more income than the original high-yield strategy ever could. This thought fascinates Winston because it reveals one of the strangest truths about wealth building. Sometimes the fastest path toward large future income involves intentionally accepting very little income in the present. It feels deeply counterintuitive to human psychology, almost unnatural even, because the mind constantly searches for immediate validation that progress is happening. Yet many of the world's wealthiest investors became successful precisely because they tolerated years of invisible compounding before the rewards finally became obvious to everyone else. As Winston gazes quietly out the rain-streaked window at the sleeping city below, he realizes that investing is not simply about numbers or percentages at all. It is about deciding whether you are trying to impress your present self or empower your future self. And the more honestly he confronts that question, the more he understands how easily short-term emotional satisfaction can quietly sabotage extraordinary long-term outcomes without people ever realizing it until decades have already passed. As the soft ticking of the old clock beside his bookshelf echoes through the apartment and the city outside slips deeper into silence, Winston begins reflecting on a force so powerful that it quietly determines the outcome of countless investment journeys, yet remains almost invisible to most people because its effects unfold so gradually over time. The extraordinary power of dividend reinvestment. Sitting beneath the warm glow of the desk lamp with the sleeves of his white shirt rolled carefully to his elbows, he opens two nearly identical portfolio projections on his tablet and studies them with growing fascination. At first, the differences appear almost meaningless. Both investors begin with the same $100,000, both choose similar investments, and both receive the same dividend payments every year. But one tiny behavioral difference slowly changes everything. In the first projection, the investor spends the dividend income as soon as it arrives, using the money for dinners, vacations, monthly bills, or small luxuries that provide immediate enjoyment and emotional satisfaction. In the second projection, every single dividend payment is automatically reinvested into purchasing additional shares, allowing the portfolio itself to quietly grow larger each year without any dramatic visible moment announcing that transformation. What shocks Winston is how small the difference feels in the beginning compared to how massive it becomes decades later. During the early years, reinvesting dividends hardly seems exciting at all. The additional shares purchased with each payment appear tiny, almost insignificant, and emotionally it can feel as though nothing meaningful is happening. Yet beneath the surface, a silent chain reaction has already begun. Those newly purchased shares start generating their own dividends, which then purchase even more shares, which eventually produce even larger streams of dividends in the future. The process resembles a snowball rolling downhill, almost harmless at first but gradually expanding into something powerful enough to reshape an investor's entire financial future. As Winston watches the long-term projections unfold year after year across the glowing screen, he notices that the gap between the two investors begins widening slowly at first, then accelerating with almost frightening intensity as compounding gains momentum. After 20 years, the investor who consistently reinvested dividends may possess hundreds of thousands of dollars more in total wealth despite making no additional contributions beyond the original investment. The realization leaves Winston staring silently at the screen because it reveals something profoundly important about how wealth is truly built. Enormous financial outcomes are often created not through dramatic decisions, but through small repeated behaviors maintained consistently over long periods of time. He begins thinking about how difficult this is emotionally for most people to sustain. Human beings naturally want to enjoy visible rewards immediately. Seeing dividend payments arrive creates temptation because the money feels earned, almost like a bonus for being patient, and spending it provides an instant sense of gratification that reinvestment cannot emotionally compete with in the short term. Reinvestment feels invisible, delayed, and psychologically unrewarding at first because the benefits remain hidden far in the future. Yet ironically, those invisible choices may ultimately determine whether an investor merely feels financially comfortable for a few moments or becomes genuinely wealthy decades later. As the rain continues tapping softly against the window beside him, Winston recalls how many people misunderstand compounding because they expect it to feel dramatic early on. But true compounding behaves more like the slow growth of roots beneath the soil before a tree finally rises high enough for everyone to notice. Most of the transformation happens quietly, without applause, without excitement, and without immediate emotional reinforcement. This realization deeply changes the way Winston thinks about investing because he begins understanding that patience is not simply waiting. Patience is continuing to make intelligent decisions, even when the rewards remain temporarily invisible. And perhaps that is why so few people ever experience the full power of compounding. Not because the math is complicated, but because enduring years of delayed gratification requires emotional discipline that most individuals struggle to maintain consistently in a world obsessed with immediate results. As another evening drifts quietly into the early hours of the morning, and the glow from Winston's apartment window becomes one of the few remaining lights still visible across the sleeping city, he begins thinking about something far more dangerous than market volatility, inflation, or even poor stock selection. Sitting motionless in his neatly pressed vest, while absent-mindedly tracing circles around the rim of his coffee cup, he realizes that one of the greatest threats to long-term wealth is not external at all, but psychological. The human mind, despite all its intelligence, is astonishingly vulnerable to emotional rewards, and dividend investing exploits this weakness in ways most people never fully recognize. Every time a dividend payment arrives in an account, no matter how small, it creates a subtle emotional reaction that feels deeply satisfying. The investor experiences a quiet sense of progress, productivity, and validation, almost as though the portfolio itself has become an employee generating income without requiring physical labor. Winston understands this feeling intimately because he has experienced it himself countless times. There is something incredibly comforting about seeing money appear automatically, especially in a world where most income requires stress, schedules, deadlines, and exhaustion. Dividend payments create the illusion that financial freedom is already beginning, even when the actual long-term math may suggest otherwise. As he reflects on this, Winston starts realizing how easily that emotional satisfaction can slowly distort decision-making. Investors begin checking their accounts obsessively, waiting for the next payment with anticipation similar to a paycheck, and before long the focus subtly shifts away from building maximum wealth toward maximizing emotional reassurance. This is the trap few people talk about openly. The excitement generated by cash flow can become addictive enough that investors start prioritizing the feeling of receiving income over the actual effectiveness of the investment strategy itself. Winston compares it mentally to someone choosing a restaurant entirely based on portion size, without caring whether the food is healthy, nutritious, or even enjoyable long-term. The immediate reward dominates the decision, while deeper quality considerations fade into the background. The more he studies this behavior, the more he notices how often people chase dangerously high dividend yields not because those investments are objectively superior, but because large payouts create a stronger emotional response. A stock paying 8 or 9% annually feels thrilling in the present moment, especially compared to a slower-growing business paying almost nothing. Yet behind those oversized yields there is often hidden fragility, declining businesses, unsustainable payout ratios, shrinking revenues, or economic pressures quietly eroding the company beneath the surface. What terrifies Winston is how quickly this situation can unravel. When a company finally cuts its dividend, investors frequently experience a devastating double shock at the exact same moment. First, the income stream they emotionally depended on suddenly shrinks or disappears entirely. Second, the stock price itself often collapses because income-focused investors rush to sell simultaneously. The result is not merely disappointment but financial damage from two directions at once, and recovering from such losses can take many painful years. As he stares thoughtfully into the dim reflections dancing across the apartment window, Winston realizes that the most successful long-term investors are often the ones capable of separating emotional gratification from rational decision-making. They do not invest simply to feel rewarded today. They invest according to what is most likely to create lasting wealth over decades. This distinction sounds simple intellectually, but emotionally it is incredibly difficult because human beings naturally crave reassurance that their efforts are working. A rapidly growing stock producing little current income can feel emotionally unsatisfying even when it may ultimately create far greater financial freedom in the future. Meanwhile, high dividend payouts can create a comforting illusion of success, even when the underlying investment quietly stagnates beneath the surface. The deeper Winston thinks about it, the more he understands that investing is not merely a battle against market uncertainty, but against the impulses inside the human mind itself. Patience competes against impatience. Logic competes against dopamine. Future abundance competes against present comfort. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the investors most obsessed with feeling rich today may unintentionally prevent themselves from ever becoming truly wealthy tomorrow. As dawn slowly approaches and the dark blue sky beyond the apartment window begins fading into softer shades of gray, Winston remains seated at his desk, exhausted but unable to stop thinking about another piece of investing that most people completely ignore until it quietly begins draining enormous amounts of wealth from their future: taxes. The subject feels painfully boring compared to exciting discussions about passive income or rapidly growing stocks, and because of that, many investors underestimate just how powerful taxes become when compounded across decades. Wearing his slightly wrinkled vest after an entire night spent researching, Winston opens several portfolio calculators and starts comparing two investors who appear identical on the surface, but structure their investments differently behind the scenes. What he discovers leaves him deeply unsettled. One investor holds dividend-paying stocks inside a normal taxable brokerage account, meaning every dividend payment immediately creates a tax obligation regardless of whether the money is spent or reinvested. The other investor places similar assets inside tax-advantaged retirement accounts, where dividends can continue compounding without being reduced year after year by taxes. At first, the yearly differences seem relatively small, almost insignificant enough to ignore. Losing a few $100s annually to taxes does not feel catastrophic emotionally, especially when compared to the larger fluctuations of the stock market itself. But as Winston extends the timeline further into the future, those seemingly minor losses begin expanding into something surprisingly destructive. Money lost to taxes today is not merely money gone once. It is future compounding permanently erased forever. Every dollar removed from the portfolio loses the opportunity to grow, generate additional dividends, appreciate in value, and compound repeatedly over decades. The realization slowly settles into Winston's mind like a heavy weight, because he understands that many investors focus obsessively on finding the perfect stock, while completely neglecting the structure surrounding the investment itself. Yet sometimes improving tax efficiency can create more wealth than selecting a slightly better performing stock. He imagines two identical portfolios growing side by side over 30 years, one continuously leaking small portions of capital through unnecessary taxation, while the other compounds uninterrupted like a river flowing freely toward the future. In the beginning, the difference appears almost invisible, but by the end, the gap becomes enormous enough to completely reshape retirement outcomes, financial security, and even the level of freedom a person experiences later in life. As the first traces of morning light spill softly across the room, Winston also begins thinking about how unpredictable the broader economy can become, and how dangerous it is to treat dividend income as something permanently guaranteed. During stable economic periods, dividend payments can feel reliable enough that investors start viewing them almost like salaries. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates how quickly those assumptions can collapse when businesses face severe financial pressure. Winston remembers reading about economic crises, where companies once considered extremely dependable suddenly reduced or suspended their dividends entirely in order to preserve cash and survive uncertain conditions. Investors who depended heavily on that income often experienced enormous stress because they had built lifestyles around cash flows they believed were secure. The lesson unsettles him because it reveals another hidden psychological danger. When income feels consistent for long enough, people begin assuming permanence in systems that are ultimately still vulnerable to change. Even strong businesses can encounter recessions, industry disruptions, rising interest rates, technological shifts, or unexpected global crises capable of altering their ability to maintain generous payouts. Sitting silently as sunlight gradually pushes away the darkness inside the apartment, Winston realizes that intelligent investing is not about finding a magical strategy that eliminates uncertainty forever. Instead, it is about building systems resilient enough to survive uncertainty without collapsing emotionally or financially when conditions inevitably change. This understanding shifts his perspective once again, because he begins seeing dividend income not as a guaranteed paycheck, but as one component inside a much larger financial structure that must remain adaptable over time. The more deeply he reflects on it, the clearer it becomes that successful investors are rarely the people who assume the future will remain perfectly stable. They are the people who quietly prepare for instability while continuing to think decades ahead regardless of temporary fear, excitement, or economic noise. And perhaps that is one of the hardest lessons about wealth building of all. True financial strength is not created by chasing certainty, but by learning how to remain disciplined even in a world where certainty never truly exists. As pale morning sunlight begins filtering through the curtains and illuminating the scattered notebooks covering his desk, Winston sits quietly in the stillness of the apartment, feeling as though the long night of reflection has slowly transformed the way he understands money itself. His vest is slightly creased now, his coffee long gone cold, yet his mind feels sharper than it did hours earlier because the deeper he explored the world of dividend investing, the more he realized that the true battle was never simply about numbers, percentages, or stock selection. It was about human behavior, patience, identity, and the uncomfortable tension between wanting immediate comfort and building lasting freedom. Looking back at all the scenarios he had studied throughout the night, The broad index funds quietly compounding wealth, the high-yield dividend stocks producing seductive streams of income, the powerful growth companies sacrificing present payouts for future expansion. Winston begins understanding that none of these strategies are inherently perfect or completely flawed on their own. The real danger comes from misunderstanding what each strategy is designed to accomplish, and then using it for the wrong purpose simply because it feels emotionally attractive in the moment. He realizes that many investors are not actually pursuing the highest long-term returns possible. Instead, they are unconsciously pursuing emotional relief from financial anxiety. Dividend income feels reassuring because it creates visible evidence that progress is happening. Growth investing feels uncertain because the rewards remain distant and invisible for years. Yet invisible growth, when given enough time, can eventually produce levels of wealth that early income-focused investing may never reach. This thought lingers deeply in Winston's mind because it forces him to confront something surprisingly personal. Perhaps the hardest part of becoming wealthy is not understanding financial concepts, but emotionally tolerating the long waiting periods required for compounding to work its magic. Human beings naturally want proof that their sacrifices are paying off right now. They want signs, rewards, reassurance, and momentum they can immediately see. But the most extraordinary financial outcomes are often built silently beneath the surface long before anyone notices them. As he stares thoughtfully out at the waking city below, Winston begins imagining wealth not as a sudden breakthrough moment, but as the gradual result of thousands of disciplined decisions repeated consistently over time. Every dividend reinvested instead of spent. Every emotional urge resisted during market volatility. Every year spent allowing businesses to grow stronger instead of constantly chasing excitement and immediate gratification. None of these individual decisions appear dramatic on their own, yet together they slowly shape an entirely different future. He thinks about how society constantly encourages people to seek instant rewards, instant entertainment, instant success, instant income, and how investing quietly demands the exact opposite mindset. The market often rewards delayed gratification, emotional restraint, and patience so prolonged that it can feel almost unnatural in a fast-moving world obsessed with short-term results. This realization makes Winston understand why truly successful investors are comparatively rare. It is not because investing itself is impossibly complicated, but because consistently thinking long-term while surrounded by short-term temptations requires unusual psychological discipline. The irony, he realizes, is that many people chasing passive income are ultimately seeking freedom, yet the emotional need for immediate rewards can keep them trapped in strategies that limit their future potential. Meanwhile, the investors willing to delay gratification and endure years of quiet compounding may eventually reach a point where wealth itself creates far greater freedom than any early dividend payout ever could. As sunlight spreads fully across the room and the city begins stirring awake beneath him, Winston closes the investment app on his tablet and sits silently for a moment, no longer asking himself how much income $100,000 can produce today. Instead, he asks a far more powerful question. What kind of life could that money build if treated with enough patience, intelligence, and time? And in that moment, he finally understands that the answer to that question may matter infinitely more than the temporary excitement of any dividend payment ever could.